everyone, welcome to one of my favorite Halloween tutorials. I love this because it's one shape and you can make so many different designs. You can really be creative with what you do, but I'll give you some ideas. So here we're going to start with a pumpkin shape. You can use any pumpkin shape that you have, even a big circle if you don't have a pumpkin. And we're going to put some of our flood icing down. And I'm just using a food safe paintbrush here and I'm spreading it out, making it nice and thin. But I don't want it quite see-through. This is going to be the background to our pumpkin. Our first pumpkin is going to be a scary dark face with kind of a glowing eyes and mouth. So after I've let this base dry here, I'm going to go ahead and outline the eyes and the mouth. So you can do any shape you want here. I'm going to do these kind of little eyes and I'm leaving the bottom part where I've kind of done the little upside down U on the bottom of the eye. Those are going to be like the pupils. And here I'm using my outline consistency. You can see it's a little bit on the looser side because it's not super stiff. It's kind of shiny, so it's a little bit more wet. And you can see my lines aren't super sharp, but it's still working. It's holding its shape. It's not flooding into a puddle, so it's good enough. So again, if you stress about your consistencies and not having them perfect, it's okay, it happens to the best of us. We kind of just go with it. I'm gonna make a nice scary mouth, and then I'm gonna go ahead and outline the sections of the pumpkin. So first I'm gonna do the middle part around his face. And now you can keep this section as one big section, or if you want to divide it up like I am here, you can go ahead and do that. So what I'm gonna do is just pipe the lines down the side here, trying to make them as kind of continuing as much as I can. And then I'm going to do another section as well. And again, it's really up to you how you want to do these designs, how many sections of the pumpkin. I kind of like to switch it up. And then we're going to do the outsides here. So basically I'm getting all my outlines ready. And then we're going to let the outlines dry for a little bit, and then we're going to go in and flood the sections. So just on the bottom of these outside sections, I'm going to wrap up my line a bit so it's just a little bumpy at the end, so it kind of looks like a nice pumpkin. You can always use your scribe if you need to go in and fix something, if a little peak is formed or it's not quite connected. Now you can see that my outlines have dried because they're not shiny anymore. They're kind of dull looking. I like to dry my outline because it keeps the shape much better than if I went in and flooded it right away, because the flood tends to push the outline out, and so then you kind of lose that shape that you've outlined. So with the same consistency that I've outlined, I'm going to do these squiggles. Now with the squiggles, I will pipe the sections that I need to with my outline like this. So I've done the middle one and the outsides, and then I go right away and flood. I don't wait for the squiggle to dry, only because when it dries, the icing gets hard and it breaks off easier. And so sometimes when I'm piping with my bag, I might knock it into it a little bit, and then you have little pieces of dry icing floating around in your flood. So that's why I tend not to dry it. Some people like to wait for it to dry and then pipe over it, but I find it works just as good this way, and it looks a lot smoother for me. So I'm going to pipe this middle section first, and then I'm going to go ahead and pipe the outside sections. There's a lot of little corners and points that I can't quite get to with my bag because the hole is big, the icing is flowy, so I don't want to over flood those areas and get them where I'm not supposed to get them. So I'm just using my scribe to kind of pull and push the icing all the way up to the points. My flood is quite loose, so it's, I have some time to work with it and just kind of making sure it gets covered as much as possible in all the outlines. And the reason we're going to do the middle and then the outsides is because I want those sections to be separate. And so if I went ahead and just flooded, each section side by side, the flood would kind of run into each other, it would connect over the lines, and we wouldn't have a separation. But I really want to see those kind of bumps in the pumpkin. So we're going to go to the outside section again. I'm just taking my time flooding. In the smaller areas in the corners, I'm loosening up the pressure. I don't want to push so hard. When I have a little bit more space to flood in, I can squeeze a little bit harder on the bag. And it's all about practice. If you're not sure, if you're a beginner, don't squeeze too hard right in the beginning. Get used to the pressure and how fast you need to move your bag. If you push the bag, if you're pushing on the bag really hard and you're not moving very fast, your icing is going to come, your icing is going to come out quite fast, and it's going to start to kind of pool around your tip. So then if that's happening, make sure you loosen the pressure a little bit on the bag. And every time I come to a small point or a corner, I always let go of the pressure a little bit, and really light pressure, because you don't want to overflood that section. You don't want it to start going over the outlines that you've done. It's kind of like when you're coloring and you have a really small section. You're not going to color super fast and super crazy as you would in a big section. You would just do it, nicely, and kind of take your time and do small little strokes with your pencil. The same thing with your piping bag. You want to take it easy, loosen the pressure up, and do those little details. So I'm just going to do the stem here, and I'm using my outline consistency. It's a small area. I don't need to outline it. It'll not flow off the cookie, so I'll just go ahead and do that and smooth it with my scribe. And you can see I've dried the other sections here because they're kind of dull looking. They're not as wet looking. And then I'm going to go and flatten the rest of the pumpkin. So again, I've done my squiggles. This prevents cratering. So sometimes, you pipe everything, you flood everything, all looks good, and then you wake up the next morning and you have holes or you have indents in your icing. That's what we call a crater. So this squiggle line helps that not to happen, because we want nice puffy looking icing. And again, I'm just using my scribe and pulling it to all the corners. It's kind of a thin, narrow section. So I'm just letting my scribe do the work. If my piping bag can't get in those sections, no worries. You'll see I'll have some really narrow parts coming in here. I'm taking my time. I'm flooding a little bit slower. And sometimes I'll even just lighten the pressure and just kind of bring my bag up in those narrow sections. Going really slow because I'm really trying to be careful not to flood on top of another section. You can always pull the icing with your scribe if need be. And if you have tiny, tiny sections you're flooding first, you can always have a smaller hole in your bag and then cut bigger as needed. And there you have it, our cool, scary pumpkin. So next up, we have the same shape, but we're gonna do Frankenstein Pumpkin. So this one I'm gonna outline the pumpkin areas first, because what we're gonna do is cover the whole base. So I'm going to make it easy for myself and just do 3 sections so I don't have so many sections to fill in or kind of worry about the bumps. So again, doing the middle section first, I put a little squiggle. My motto is, if you're unsure if it's going to crater, just go for it. Put your squiggle down and then flood on top. So once my middle section has dried or crusted over, we can go ahead and do those outside sections. So you see once I've flooded the outside, you can see there's a nice line going down the middle separating the sections. So that's the difference between waiting for those sections to crust over versus not waiting. And then we're going to go ahead and add some hair. So I've got my black outline consistency, and my sections on the bottom, my green icing is all crusted over. So while I let my black outline dry, I'm going to add some eyes. So I'm going in with some white outline consistency, so my thick icing, and while that's wet, I go in with my black outline consistency, and I just kind of add the eyeballs in there, and then adding a few details on the side with my outline consistencies, my detail icing, adding some marks on the face, and then we can add a line for the mouth. Then with my white outline consistency, again my thick consistency, I'm going to do the teeth and I'm going to fix them up with a scribe to make them nice and square looking. And now that I've done all that, my outline for my hair has dried, and then I can go ahead and fill it in. Now normally this section I would do a squiggle and then fill it in, but because my base layer is still kind of wet, it's just crusted on top but it's wet underneath. Normally that also helps prevent craters, so I can go ahead and just flood the hair as normal, and that should take care of any craters because it's on that kind of semi-wet dry layer on the bottom. And there you have it. It's one of my favorite pumpkins. Alright, on to the next one. We've got our Dracula Pumpkin. Now this one is similar to the green one that we just did, our Frankenstein, but we're going to make him Dracula. So again, I'm roughly doing my 3 sections of the pumpkin. It's just easier to pipe a face when you don't have so many kind of lines going through the pumpkins. But again, if you want to make a bunch of sections, go for it. If you want to make it simple and just do a few sections, that's totally fine too. So again, I start with my middle layer, but I have to wait for that to crust over before I move on to the side layers. So again, always putting a squiggly line if I think maybe it'll crust over. And I usually do it if it's a narrow area or if it's small. So if it's kind of, it's on borderline, I'd say just go for it. Better safe than sorry. Drying with a fan also will help. If you have a fan nearby your cookies, just blowing gently, that'll help prevent craters. If you have a dehydrator as well, on a very low heat setting, that will also help with craters. So we're going to outline the hair. So I'm going to give them a nice big widow's peak. And then I'm going to fill in the top there, the little stem with my outline consistency. Very small area, so it's easily able to be filled in with my outline. And while my outline for the hair dries, I'll go ahead and fill in the face details. So I'll add some nice pointy eyebrows. And this is all done with my outline consistency, all these little details, because we want them to hold their shape and they're kind of small. And so we'll add the eyeballs as well and do the same thing. So while the white is still wet, we will go ahead and add the black right inside there, and then it kind of gives this smooth look. And then we're going to go ahead and add a line for the mouth and give that line, a couple minutes to dry. And while we do that, we're going to add the nose. So again, this is my outline consistency in purple. And then we'll go ahead and we'll add some nice fang teeth. So what I do is just put a little pressure and pull down on the bag to make it a little bit pointy. And again, if you're having problems with that, you can also use your scribe to pull the icing down. And now that we've done all those details, we can go ahead and fill in the hair. Normally I would put a squiggle line and flat on top, but because my base layer isn't fully dry, that really helps prevent the craters. So we can go ahead and just flood this as normal. But again, if you're not sure, you don't want to risk it, you can go ahead and do it. And we end up with a really cool looking Dracula pumpkin. Next up, we have a really simple, easy mummy cookie. Now, if you're looking for a Halloween design that doesn't take much time, this is a great one because you really don't have to make multiple colors, really just 1 or 2, your orange for the eyes and black for the pupils, and that's it. So again, I'm going to outline my pumpkin here, taking my time to go slow. You can see my left finger in the video right now that's holding my bag steady. And this really, really helps, especially when doing outlines. And then I'm going to go ahead and flood. And I've let this outline dry just a little bit. And I'm flooding right up to the line there, taking my time. And again, guiding my piping bag with my left finger. And I'm holding and putting pressure with my right hand. So kind of like two-handed piping. And I have usually my elbow or my forearm leaning against my table just to give myself a little bit of steadiness. Sometimes when you're doing a larger cookie, you kind of have to give a little bit more range of motion. You have to move your forearm or your elbow a little bit. So sometimes I'll stop if I need to move it and then continue and just reposition yourself to make it comfortable. Now that the middle's dry, I'm going to go ahead and flood the sides. So again, we've got our squiggle here and our outline consistency. And I'm kind of squishing it against just to widen the squiggle a bit. And then I'll just go ahead and flood right over. So again, careful near the outlines, and then you'll see that when I get into those tight little corners, I try to get in there. If I can't get in there all the way, I'll get there with my scribe and just doing it as close as to the seam that I can, using the pressure of my bag to pipe nice and close to that seam. And then I can go in with my scribe and pull it right to the corner. And then same thing again, I'm going to go nice and close to that seam there, using the pressure of my bag to bubble that icing up against that seam. And that'll create a nice smooth line. You want the icing to do that work and kind of nicely coat that seam right beside it. You don't want to put too much pressure or too close because you will go over that. And now we've got nice lines coming down our pumpkin. And now, since the middle section has already crusted over, we can go ahead and add our eyes. Here I've got some orange outline consistency. You can see it's pretty thick there because my marks are kind of in my bag. I'm squishing and wiggling my bag as I'm piping here. I'm just pushing pressure in one spot and kind of just wiggling my bag, and that'll just smooth it out as I'm going. But I do need to go in with my scribe a little bit, give it a jiggle. So whenever you have thicker icing, if you've got a good amount of thick icing, it's much easier to smooth out. If this was a really, really thin layer of orange icing, I wouldn't be able to smooth it out like this. But because it's a good bubble amount of icing there, I can go in with my scribe, give it a good jiggle, and you can see it smooths out really nicely and becomes nice and shiny. And now, while it's still wet, I'm going to add with my black outline consistency. I'm putting my black tip right above the orange icing and just kind of putting that icing right inside. And again, right in the black area, I'm not touching the orange anymore because that's kind of starting to dry a little bit. I will go in and just give it a nice smooth jiggle, and it'll kind of settle in that orange. Your scribe is your best friend. If you don't have one, you can use anything that's sharp or a toothpick, but they're pretty cheap. So if you don't have one, it's a great tool to start with. And now the rest of my cookie is dried, so the outsides have dried now. Dried enough that I can pipe on top without it kind of ruining the icing. And I'm just going to go with my outline consistencies of my thicker icing here and just draw lines across the pumpkin. So this will give us our mummy look. And notice that when I'm piping these lines, they're holding their shape. Even if I pipe one on top of the other, they're not melting into each other. So this is the big difference between outline consistency and flood. If I was doing this with my flood, my line would start to spread out as I was piping it, and it would start to melt into the other lines. But this is thick, it's drier icing, has more powdered sugar in it, less water, and so it really holds its shape. So this is, again, doubles as my outline and my detail icing. A lot of people don't like to make two consistencies, they think it takes more time, but for me, normally, because we're always doing some kind of details on the cookies, I really like to have both consistencies, and I've already got it done. And worst case, if I ever need flood, I've got some outline icing usually always left over, and I could just thin it down for more flood. And you just keep adding lines until you're happy with it. There, my line kind of broke, it didn't quite stick, so I'm gonna go back and redo it there a little bit. And I like this because super fun, simple cookie, and it looks great. Really like those orange beady eyes, staring through the white icing. Now to our last design is our traditional pumpkin cookie. So here I'm putting some flood icing, just making a fun design. You don't need to do this. And then we're going to go in with our paintbrush and just paint it over. So this is going to be the background to give our pumpkin a little bit of dimension. So if you need more icing, go ahead and pour a little bit more on there. We want to make sure that we get a lot covered so that when we're piping our design, we don't see any of the cookie color come through. We want it all to be the black background. So I'm carefully just going to try to spread this to the edges, but not all the way. The good part of doing it this way is that this icing dries pretty quick. Even though it's flood, it's such a thin layer that a couple minutes in front of the fan or, just air drying, it will dry pretty quick and you can do the next layer. So I want to make sure that my layer is dry so that I don't mix up my black and my orange icing. So here I'm just going to do eyes. And then I'm just going to put the eyeballs in here. So you can kind of see the shape coming together with the black background. And I'm just going to do a big open mouth here, kind of like a scared looking pumpkin. You can really do any design you'd like. I made the black background nice and big because I wasn't quite sure what I was going to do, if I was going to do a big smiley one or if I was going to do this design. So just to keep my options open, that's why I painted the whole background black. And then we're going to do our section in the middle here around the face. And then I'm going to do the outlines of the sides. See how I'm lifting my piping bag up? It gives me a nice straight line. If you pipe really, really close to your cookie, especially on these nice long lines, your line won't be as smooth or straight. So really, you always want to attach your icing and then lift up your bag so the line lays nicely on your cookie. And then we want to take the same consistency. So this is what I used to outline, and I'm going to go ahead and just scribble all over in there and flood right on top. And what I did is, because I knew I was going to do this design, so I didn't cut a huge hole in my piping bag. There's a lot of narrow, small spaces here. And if my hole is too big, a lot of icing will flow out and there's a risk of going over the lines. So when I'm doing designs or kind of planning things, I always cut a smaller hole if I know I'm going to be doing smaller areas. The icing will flow regardless because it's a looser icing. And so I'm putting really light pressure. But if I had a really big hole, it'd be really hard to control the amount of icing that's coming out. So once this middle section has crusted over, you can see it's not as shiny as it was. There's still a little bit of shine to it because it's still not fully dry. But we can put our little squiggles and we can do the top of the pumpkin here. And this is just with my green outline consistency. Small area, put a lot of icing in there. It smooths out, no problem. And then I'm going to go ahead into flood. Now, if you need to cut your tip bigger at this point, you can. Or you can just put more pressure on the bag. So now that I'm putting more pressure, more icing is coming out and it's filling up faster. So there's a few ways to control your icing. So again, it's playing around with, if you're having trouble controlling your flood and it's kind of going everywhere, maybe your hole was cut too big. Or if your flood is not quite coming out properly, maybe you're not putting enough pressure on. If you're really struggling and have to put a lot of pressure for your flood to come out, then you would need to cut your hole bigger. And I keep my tip hovering just above the cookie, and this will kind of spread out the icing. So it's pushing the icing out as it's coming out of the bag. And this is kind of making my icing nice and spread out and covering the surface area that I need to cover. And you can kind of see the color differences between the middle and the outsides of what it looks like when it's dry and the wet icing. And that gives us that nice separation. And then just going in with my scrap to fill in those little corners that I couldn't get to. And there you have it, a traditional, cute little scared pumpkin.